What is going on, guys? It's Drew here and welcome back to FudgeMuppet. Today we have a very special video to share with you, and by God we spent a lot of time trying to make this work. So before I get started, let me just say that the reason we are making this video is because of the supposed leak on Target's website. And if one thing reeks of legitimacy and warrants us all to hop on the hype train, it's Target. It's definitely not some random incompetence or trolling from an underpaid employee, but I digress. For this video, we're going to be operating under the assumption that it is possible that Bethesda Game of Thrones is happening. We aren't saying they are making it, this is just hypothetical. But nevertheless, we were intrigued and thought it could be a bit of fun to come up with our ideal Bethesda Game of Thrones. Unfortunately, this video might not be exactly what you expected though, as the conclusions we've come to after hours of brainstorming are more about the problems we came across when trying to create this imaginary game. We didn't want to focus on the negative. In fact, all of us would be thrilled to play a Bethesda Game of Thrones game. But realistically, we just came across a ton of issues and limitations, which we'll get into in this video. We've got loads to talk about, so let's get things started. The first thing to emphasize about this potential project is what Bethesda Game Studios are good at. The areas in which they excel and the areas where they fall short could be telling about what to expect if this game were in development. Bethesda create fantastic open world RPGs with a huge focus on the role-playing and exploration. For argument's sake, let's compare them to CD Projekt Red, the creators of the Witcher game series. CDPR nail the plot and create characters who are utterly unforgettable, but it'd be hard to picture CDPR giving us the creative freedom that Bethesda gives us. Picking your origin, your race, and how you roleplay within the world around you is done masterfully by Bethesda, and that much is obvious from the countless builds we've been able to make in their worlds. So we want to assume that Bethesda would stick to what they know and what gave them such a stellar reputation in the first place. You could argue that they'd approach this game differently, but if we wanted a Game of Thrones game focused on plot and characters, would Bethesda Game Studios really be the #1 pick? I mean, could you imagine experiencing a Song of Ice and Fire's complex and intricate political intrigue through Bethesda dialogue options? So you could respond to this by saying, Westeros is a pretty interesting place. Why couldn't Bethesda just make a game focused on role-playing and exploration like they're good at? Well, my question to anyone thinking that is, what do you actually want from a Game of Thrones video game? And why do you like the television or book series in the first place? When coming up with this video, we constantly felt ourselves getting caught on these questions. We like this series for the deep and interesting three-dimensional characters, and the storytelling which throws you onto an emotional roller coaster. If we wanted role-playing and exploration with no real involvement in the politics and the competition to seat your ass on the Iron Throne, wouldn't Bethesda be better off just focusing on The Elder Scrolls 6? The world building in George R.R. Martin's universe is fascinating, and as a book nerd, I can very much vouch for that fact. So I don't doubt that the world Bethesda would give us to explore would be incredible. But think about it. The Elder Scrolls universe is so much better suited for a video game. The lore is vast and characters can easily slot into any corner of the world without losing the Elder Scrolls feel. Whereas with A Song of Ice and Fire, the world is more reminiscent of medieval England during the War of the Roses. If you aren't a pivotal character in the fight for the throne, aren't 90% of the players going to be angry? Most Game of Thrones fans don't know a great deal about the world outside of the main plot, and if they made a game in the Vale, for example, which I would have loved personally, most people wouldn't be able to tell it's even a Game of Thrones game. The Iron Throne literally wouldn't even feature in the game, and no matter where it is set, we have to assume that George R.R. Martin's lore cannot be tampered with, as it is essential for telling his story. So if you're an important player in the War for the Throne, you would be shoehorned into playing for the winning side, or being forced to lose. The way we see it, Game of Thrones is macro. And by that, I mean characters are constantly changing the course of history, and everything has an impact on the bigger picture. Everyone from low to highborn is dragged into this war for control of King's Landing, and it's hard to imagine a way in which you can be free to roleplay without affecting the overarching plot. And if they somehow made it work so that you didn't need to mess with the overarching plot, it would lose the Game of Thrones vibe. It's a bit of a lose-lose situation. On the other hand, The Elder Scrolls is micro. This means that individual heroes can go on their own journeys, big or small, without their influence causing waves throughout the whole continent. And even if the Dragonborn had a huge effect on Tamriel, the lore will be built around that possibility. Another thing about the world building, which I kind of hit on, was the fact that this is a lot like medieval England. Think about Bethesda's exploration and what makes it so great. In the high fantasy setting of The Elder Scrolls, every cave has a troll, or a creature, or a million other things hidden inside. In Game of Thrones, the only foes you'll find in your adventure are highwaymen, bandits, and maybe some bears and wolves. I can call upon some book knowledge to say that other fantasy creatures are mentioned. In A Storm of Swords, the third book, Varys claims that a kraken has been seen off the fingers. A true kraken. It attacked an Ibonese whaler and pulled it under. But this is dismissed as either a lie or a freak occurrence. High fantasy foes are so rare in Westeros that it would be wrong to call them a potential enemy. And on top of that, magic is such an obscure force in Game of Thrones that while exploring you will almost certainly be limited to melee combat or archery. Spellcasting just isn't a thing, and the way magic is portrayed in Game of Thrones, it's more mysterious and hard to define. There are no rules for Game of Thrones magic. It would be hard to make this work as some kind of in-game mechanic. So with all of this in mind, the life of your average Elder Scrolls inhabitant is likely to be much more interesting than your average Joe in Westeros. Let's change the subject for a little while to talk about the setting. We mentioned this in bits and pieces before, alluding to the fact that we wouldn't want Bethesda just to reskin an Elder Scrolls game, as it wouldn't do justice to the unique feel of the Game of Thrones universe. When talking about the setting, one big problem arises. Westeros is massive, and Essos makes Westeros look tiny. So we know what Bethesda are capable of for the most part. They could potentially make a map much larger than that of Skyrim, but if they did, wouldn't we lose much of the detail? Surely characters would be even less fleshed out than before, and much of that attention to detail in worlds like Skyrim would suffer. We know from the show and the books that Westeros is giant, and takes a hell of a long time to traverse. So if we wanted a game that took place in the whole continent, wouldn't it seem ridiculous if you could see Winterfell and Sunspear from the Red Keep's tallest tower in King's Landing? And if we don't use the whole continent, where the hell do you set the game? The books and show take place in every corner of Westeros and Essos, and these places are simply too damn big to effectively incorporate everything. And with the inevitable fact that we have to pick a smaller area to set the game, how do you avoid leaving out iconic locations that fans of the series would hate to miss out on? I mean, we thought hard about this, and our best solution was that it could operate like a hub system. Each of the 7 kingdoms could potentially have a main city and some surrounding area, but there would definitely be some serious disconnect between the land masses. You wouldn't be able to get lost on the roads, journeying out of Riften and following the signposts to Solitude. Instead, the game would be separated by loading screens and fast travelling. And then, with the hub system, if they can theoretically map all of Westeros, what do we get? There are no caves full of nefarious necromancers, no Dwemer ruins, no Falmer hordes to fight or giant frostbite spiders. It will most likely be a few poor villages seeking protection from bandits, a lot of fields and mountains filled with a few wolves, some deer, and maybe a bear or two. No uncovering words of power from an ancient Draugr crypt to add to your arsenal. And this all comes back to Game of Thrones' more realistic, gritty setting. While we undeniably love the world building in George Martin's universe, it suffers from its low fantasy setting when translated into a video game. In the Elder Scrolls, there are no limits to the wonders you encounter, because the world is built to function well as a game. The recurring problem that keeps rearing its head in each section is that in a game, how can we properly experience the Game of Thrones, the grand battles, the politics, the tension between feuding lords? How do we get all of this without jeopardizing the lore and the way the events need to transpire to fit the timeline? Speaking of which, the timeline was our next point of discussion for the setting. We decided that we would either want the game to be set concurrently with the events of the book or beforehand. There really is no possibility of going into the future, as that would mean creating lore from events that haven't actually occurred yet. Hypothetically speaking, Westeros could be taken over by White Walkers by the end of the book series. Is it really viable to set a game in a future that may seriously contradict and detract from the events of the past? A counter-argument here could be that Bethesda may have been told everything they need to know about future lore. A counter-argument here could be that maybe Bethesda have been told everything they need to make sure any future lore fits what comes before it. But is that really believable? I mean, the showrunners for HBO were only given the bare-bone details of how to get to the end of the story. At this point, it is so far removed from the book canon that it is really hard to believe Bethesda were given more information than the guys responsible for one of the most successful shows on TV. On top of this, George Martin is so protective of his work that should anything happen to him, he wants nobody else to finish his story. Does that sound like the kind of guy who is willing to let a game company with no real plot creating prowess write their own lore? So if the timeline is during the events of the show and books, or in the very well documented past, how do we create a role-playing experience that doesn't mess with the existing lore? The lore is concrete for most of the major events in the timeline, so our player character will have to work around it, killing no butterflies in the process. The protagonist would have to be less consequential on the grand scheme of the world for the game to make sense in the context of the bigger picture. With that said, there is no choice but to take the Game of Thrones out of Game of Thrones. Before we switch subjects again, let me re-emphasize something. Westeros is really not cut out for being interesting on the micro scale. I repeat, the micro scale. Westeros is fantastic in so many ways, and I am a massive fanboy of George R.R. Martin's world, but it works on a macro scale, with rich history, epic battles, beautiful castles, and cities that stretch for miles and have 500,000 inhabitants. For the life of a common person or an insignificant mercenary, it would never be able to live up to the brilliance of the Game of Thrones. I know I've been really pessimistic and negative so far, and we really wanted to make an epic ideal Bethesda Game of Thrones video, but it's just a case of some things simply not translating well across mediums. If you guys can think of ways the setting could be adapted well without losing the Game of Thrones feel, absolutely discuss it in the comments below, as we'd love to hear it. But this is just our take on the situation, being as clinical and realistic as possible with our expectations. We've already hit on this topic, but there is a little more to go over in regards to the game's potential exploration and enemies. Bethesda Game Studios are amazing when it comes to these aspects. The ability to be dropped into their worlds, getting inside the brain of an Argonian former slave, with a dream of worshipping and serving Boethia, or maybe getting inside the mind of a raider, fresh from a torturous eternity in Vault 111, hell-bent on enslaving the Commonwealth and using his super sledge to crush Mile queens. In Martin's medieval European-style setting, you simply don't get this level of customization and creativity. The locations are wondrous in Westeros, but this is mostly due to the cities, and the lords and ladies in control of those cities. They're not wondrous for their terrain, and exploration won't take you anywhere you couldn't get to by going for a walk in your closest national park. As for enemies, you won't be fighting no dragons or White Walkers. If you killed a handful of these monsters, you'd almost certainly have your name written in all of the history books and all of the songs. Just imagine Samuel Tarly picking up a book in the Citadel about the dragon-slaying adventures of your character, who froze the dragon's fire in place like a god, only to eat 16 wheels of cheese before unpausing to finish the fight. Let's be real here, if you're not going to screw with the existing lore, you might be able to kill a few bears and a pack of wolves. What about the combat? I briefly mentioned it earlier, but I left out the depressing details. If you like weaving magic in with your playstyle, that won't be happening in Bethesda Game of Thrones. In order to suit the Game of Thrones style, combat will be restricted to melee and archery. George Martin was kind enough to include some high fantasy elements to his weapons and warriors. I mean, look at Gendry with his warhammer, perfectly reminiscent of his beast of a father, Robert Baratheon. I could go into detail about how ridiculous that warhammer was, and how it is entirely inconsistent with the realism used in the rest of the combat world building. I mean, the point of balance on a warhammer is so close to the head that having a gigantic hammerhead would be impossible to wield effectively without superhuman strength. But that's not really important in a video game. I'm just saying that Game of Thrones proves here that it doesn't have to be 100% realistic in the low fantasy setting. So, in the Game of Thrones game, we could potentially get a diverse range of great swords, warhammers, battle axes and the like, but you won't be able to enchant them, and most likely no other smithing material will be able to compete with Valyrian steel. All of our builds would probably be restricted to using a Valyrian steel weapon in the endgame, as what else is there? Iron, standard steel, stone, or maybe bronze if you're a Fen from north of the wall. That's all a touch boring if you ask me, and then archery will fall into the same pitfalls. Materials will be limited, with the most interesting option being dragonbone, or specific types of timber like the golden heart trees of Summer Isles. But even then, there is no precedent in the world building for any special type of bow or arrow that may change up weapon customization. We've pretty much mentioned everything now. The last topics worth going into a bit more detail about are the characters, politics, and player choices. As I said earlier, Game of Thrones is renowned for its characters and its complex story. Bethesda games, on the other hand, are not. That isn't so much a criticism of Bethesda, but more the acknowledgement that there is a balance that must be struck. A game like Skyrim works because you have so many choices to make, and your role-playing experience benefits greatly from each of them, from the small ones to the world-changing ones. With Bethesda, you create your own story and your own experience. The world is there purely to accommodate that, and to bring your role-playing experience to life. Now think of The Witcher 3. This works because the characters already have an established personality with already decided relationships. You can make decisions, but none of them truly impact the in-game world around you. For example, if you make a similarly important decision in a Game of Thrones game, maybe after a certain wedding, there would be a whole new slew of characters occupying the north, and relationships with every character in the area would change too. The ripple effect would be out of control, which is all incredibly difficult to make possible in an open world game. I won't spoil The Witcher for anyone who hasn't played it, but the biggest choices you get to make will affect the characters close to Geralt, but you won't really see any difference to the playable areas of what you do. As Geralt of Rivia, you can't exactly run around accruing negative karma and being an absolute shit, but because of this limitation, you are rewarded with a well thought out and masterfully crafted plot. The characters are fantastic because the writers don't need to worry about the role-playing choices of the individual player. Geralt is still Geralt. He may range from smart-ass Geralt to good guy Geralt, but he's still the same character. Every RPG has to find the balance between player freedom and role-playing and a structured story. Bethesda are loved for the former, and when they strayed more towards a structured story in Fallout 4, many fans were disappointed, especially fans who wanted to roleplay as anything but a distraught parent from Vault 111. Game of Thrones won our hearts with political intrigue and brilliantly complex and likable characters, and these are things we can't be sure Bethesda would be able to pull off. How can we have lots of choices, while also having interesting characters with their own motivations? Wouldn't they just end up being puppets in our playthrough? If Bethesda Game of Thrones happens, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either they give us freedom to roleplay, giving us little opportunity to be a part of Game of Thrones' amazing story, or they give us a specific role to play in a structured narrative with little to no room for roleplaying. And that pretty much sums it up, guys. We've got through a lot in this video, but I think the best way to conclude this is by saying Bethesda excel in all of the elements revolving around player freedom and diverse roleplaying, while Game of Thrones prospers when the story is tightly structured with countless butterfly effects that simply couldn't work with a player character that has plenty of meaningful decisions to make. Add to this the difficulty of making a compelling and fleshed out setting that works on Game of Thrones' grand scale, plus the limited combat, enemies, and exploration, and it becomes really hard to give you an ideal Bethesda Game of Thrones without having unrealistic expectations. We could have made you a video pumped full of hype, but that would have come at the cost of our better judgment. Bethesda make amazing games. No one knows that better than FudgeMuppet and all of you guys watching, but they have their limitations, and we believe that their skill set would be better utilized on Fallout or the Elder Scrolls. With that said, I really hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Be sure to give it a like if you enjoyed it, and if you're new around, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We know this video is one big what if, so we'd love to hear your take on this potential Bethesda project in the comments below. Who knows, if we hear some compelling arguments, we may have to address them in a new video. But either way, thank you so much for watching, guys. I've been Drew, and I will catch you in the next one.